Having obtained that very high-level overview of TOGAF standard, next we will look at some of the foundational concepts that will offer the broad brushstrokes understanding of how TOGAF could be applied to an enterprise, and later on follow up with finer details in subsequent modules. Enterprise architecture tackles complexity through separation of concerns. TOGAF makes it easy and defines several standard approaches to divide and conquer the enterprise's complexity. One way of doing this is through what is referred to as architecture partitions. An architecture partition can be thought of as a level of abstraction of the enterprise. TOGAF defines three levels of abstraction. The top level represents the whole of enterprise perspective. The next level of abstraction represents a segment of the enterprise, and it usually corresponds to a portfolio or program level abstraction. Say, for example, the customer service portfolio or the manufacturing portfolio. And below that level of abstraction is the more granular capability level, which, for example, within a customer service portfolio may correspond to some set of capabilities such as customer information recording, customer order processing, customer feedback processing, etc. It is impossible to prescribe how an enterprise should partition itself, as it is highly dependent on its unique contexts. The operating model of an enterprise is usually a key influence on the way the partitioning is done. Within each of these partitions, TOGAF defines further separation of concerns through architecture domains. For example, if we take the capability partition, referring back to the TOGAF definition of enterprise architecture, the architecture at this level may be thought to be built out of multiple smaller components. These components could be anything ranging from a business process, a software application, a database, a web service, or it could be an infrastructure component such as a server or a firewall, and any number of other things that needs to come together to enable that capability. TOGAF breaks down the enterprise architecture within each partition into 4 standard architecture areas referred to as architecture domains, namely business architecture, data architecture, applications architecture, and technology architecture. These architecture domains are built into the core process flow used to formulate enterprise architecture. We will explore these domains in greater detail in Module 5. Broadly speaking, architects typically work with 2 primary loci of controls to guide their work, which are the architecture vision and the stakeholder concerns. Architecture vision represents strategic view of the ideal target state of enterprise architecture, and it is aligned to and enables strategic vision of the business, while stakeholder concerns refer to the collective of tactical and operational considerations and objectives, as well as apprehensions and pain points held by the key stakeholders of the architected system, and their perceptions of improvements needed to transition the system from the current state to a desired target state. A stakeholder could be defined as anyone who is impacted by and or have an interest in the outcome of an enterprise initiative. In practice, organizations require the stakeholders to understand and endorse the architecture deliverables before they are implemented. And hence, stakeholder communication and stakeholder management is a key function of enterprise architecture. Now, since stakeholder concerns form such an important influence on architecture work, it is important for architects to communicate and work effectively with various stakeholders involved. This involves representing architecture work products and outcomes to stakeholders that represents their perspective and addresses points of interest that the stakeholder can relate to. TOGAF calls this the viewpoints. To use an analogy from the civil engineering industry, for example, the architecture blueprint of the building may include many different viewpoints. You may have one viewpoint representing the plumbing requirements, for example, and another one representing the electrical and data wiring or cabling plan. And it may have another viewpoint which perhaps represents the general layout and facades of the building for marketing purpose. Similarly, in the case of enterprise architecture, different stakeholders will need to see the architecture from different vantage points that satisfy their needs and concerns. For example, if you want to represent the architecture of, say, a business-to-business enterprise integration gateway to a business process expert, you might want to define a viewpoint specific to those stakeholders and have models that depicts the process flow, the value chains, the data exchanged, etc. While there could be some overlaps, this may be very different to what you may want to present to a network security specialist who would perhaps want to see the servers, the network segments, firewalls, ports, protocols, the nature of data being transmitted, and so forth. TOGAF recommends defining and agreeing on the minimum viewpoints that are necessary to satisfy the stakeholder concerns on given initiative. While the viewpoints represent an angle or a perspective, it is expressed and articulated through views. Essentially, views that represent a viewpoint breaks down the complexity of representing the architecture and tailors it to the perspective that is most appropriate for the target audience. Now, views are themselves constructed using a number of architectural artifacts, where an architectural artifact generally falls within the following categories: catalogs, matrices, or diagrams. Usually, these are further annotated with textual descriptions to aid in better understanding and to clarify or highlight certain aspects of the architecture. To clarify again, as discussed earlier in the module through the jigsaw puzzle analogy, the enterprise architecture landscape is built out using components, referred to as the architecture building blocks. A given building block may be represented to different stakeholders through viewpoints that are tailored to them. Viewpoints are articulated through views, which are essentially a collection of architectural artifacts, and an artifact can be one of catalogs, matrices, or diagrams. Additionally, TOGAF also defines architectural deliverables, which are contractually agreed work products that may need to capture relevant architectural views of one or more architectural building blocks and their interrelationships. That brings us to the end of this very long module. To recap, in this module we looked at what really enterprise architecture is through informal analogies and through formal definitions. We then examined the role played by enterprise architecture frameworks and their value proposition. We also explored the enterprise architecture frameworks briefly from a historical perspective in order to understand the context and the needs that caused its emergence. We then took a quick lap around the components of TOGAF standard and introduced some key foundational concepts that we will build upon throughout the rest of the modules in this course. So thank you again for your patient audience. I look forward to seeing you in the next module, where we would start unraveling the core of the TOGAF framework, which is the architecture development method.